to Cafe CK. This is a regulatory podcast where we discuss a juicy regulatory topic and invite a guest each week. Our guest today is Mark Tromans.
Hi, Wes.
Hello, Mark. Mark is head of corporate for Hibberts Solicitors. Mark has done numerous deals for us at Cartwright King, so we thought he'd be a great guest to have on today to discuss through the mechanics of what's involved from the corporate side as well as the regulatory side on a law firm sale, acquisition or merger. Mark is ex-SRA and has worked in the regulatory sector as well as the private practice sectors for the last 15 years, Mark. Long time now.
Yeah, it certainly is.
So today we're going to discuss a merger and an acquisition. But before we get going, Mark, do you prefer a Teams call or a regular mobile old-fashioned call?
Probably an old-fashioned call.
Why is that?
On the well, I was saying mobile, but that's not old-fashioned. On the landline. Why is that? I don't actually know, if I'm being completely honest with you. I suppose it's nice just to I don't have to worry about what I'm doing with my face.
Good answer. I think Teams has its place. Absolutely. I think, especially on corporate deals, trying to get everyone over numerous fields, insurers, corporate solicitors, different sides of different parties in different parts of the country, along obviously with their specialist regulatory advisor, trying to get everyone in the same place at the same time, or even on an old-fashioned call, just trying to ensure that everyone is there and actually, participating in the call, having their full attention is sometimes difficult. Teams does assist with that sometimes. You can actually see everyone's face and make sure everyone's understanding and reading off the same hymn sheet before we get started.
I can certainly get on board with that. I mean, if it's a group call, Teams all the way. But if I'm talking one-on-one with someone, I'd probably go down the old-fashioned route.
Absolutely, but and I'm with you there. One-on-one call, I'll just pick up the phone. Much easier than trying to write. And also a Teams invite can sometimes feel like you have to set up a diary invite for it. It sort of staggers, the progress. Whereas you just pick up the phone and just do that call quite quickly and crack on with the deal. But that feeds in nicely to what we're here to discuss today, which is a corporate deal, an M&A deal for a law firm. So we've got some good examples that Mark's been working with us on over the last few years, done some acquisitions at Cartwright King, and Mark has been the corporate man, the solicitor behind it. So let's have a chat about how they start, how the regulatory side is involved from the outset, and what's needed and what our guys can expect should they decide to go through that process themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, from my point of view, because the first thing that I need to know is who are we actually dealing with in the transaction itself. There's a buyer, there's a seller. Who am I acting for? If I'm acting for whoever I'm acting for, if I'm being honest, I need to know who is the ultimate beneficial owner of who I'm acting for. So if it's a company purchasing, which more often than not it usually is, who owns that company? Who are the PSCs, the person with significant control? I want to know who owns more than 25% of that company. A handful of people that are the ultimate beneficial owners, then I need to identify those and make sure that they are who they say they are and that it stacks up. And the first thing I do is check company's house to see if it stacks up, but ultimately it's the company's statutory registers that you want to look at. Who is in the register of members for that company as being the shareholders.
It's really a hot topic all over the aspects regarding something like that level of due diligence in any deal, but also more so for law firms because there is a regulatory aspect, as we all understand. The SRA have to approve deals before they're completed. So you can exchange, but regarding the actual completion, you have to wait for SRA approval, as we know, going through this process a number of times. So understanding who the UBO is defines everything. Even before you even get to heads of terms, we need to know who that ultimate beneficial owner is, as there's applications to prepare. There's background checks that need to be done, as part of a wider application that we submit to the SRA to satisfy, and ultimately reach approval. What's your experience with identifying those UBOs through due diligence exercises?
So as I kind of touched on earlier, my starting point is always Company's House. I'll check for the last confirmation statement that was filed to see what the up-to-date position is in terms of who the shareholders are. As you may know, confirmation statements, they don't need to be updated every single year when they're filed. They can just say that no changes have been made. And so what you typically tend to end up doing is going back through all the annual confirmation statements to see when was the last time something changed with this company. Sometimes you have to go all the way back to the AR01, which was the old form that you used to have to file before confirmation statements came in. The AR01, in that form, you had to put a snapshot of what does the company look like on this given day, and who are the shareholders, what are their names, how many shares do they hold. So if you've got a company who've always had the same shareholders since 2016, when the last AR01 would have needed to have been filed, then you can see that from that AR01, this is who they are. What we need to do, importantly, is work our way to the present day through those confirmation statements to see, well, if there's been a change, how does it now look different, and who now are the ultimate beneficial owners, how many shares do they hold. And if you're acting for a seller in particular, is everybody on board? Do everyone want to sell their shares? Similarly, if you're acting for a buyer, do all the shareholders know about the deal, and are they happy to go ahead with it? Once you've gone through that Company's House process of checking the filing position, if there's anything that doesn't stack up, then we need to go to the company's statutory registers. So the company is obliged to maintain a statutory register, and that statutory register will contain things like, who are the directors, who are the members, who are the persons with significant control. Now the statutory register really is the gospel on those kind of pieces of information. Company's House is, I describe it really as a notice board more than anything, rather than it being the absolute concrete truth about the state of a company. The statutory registers will say this is the state of the company. Company's House is supposed to reflect that, because the company is supposed to update Company's House regularly when things change. But if someone hasn't made a change, they haven't made a filing on time, that can sometimes skew the Company's House records. But thankfully, issues like that don't typically tend to come up. It's
fair to say, isn't it, that there is a large amount of work to do before you even start, sort of getting together the heads of terms of the deal, just identifying 100%. The UBO. And from the regulatory perspective, we find it the same as well. The main and the largest part, I think, of the job, whether it's just a straightforward transaction where a solicitor's buying a law firm, or whether it's where we've done private equity buying applications. We've done applications for private equity. Some of the largest so far we've done have contained 156 individual applications. Just because there's been so many levels of holding companies and different layers of ownership, and how they've structured their thing through different jurisdictions, trusts, etc. So I absolutely agree. The largest amount of work usually involved from the outset is identifying who ultimately is the beneficial owner and how they hold their shares at what different levels, and then we can work out. And I think it's also really important to identify that as early as possible, so we can give a fair pricing up front for the work. Obviously, if there's huge amounts of work involved, going up chains and chains of ownership and ladders and applications needed, you'll be the same as you're drafting SPAs, etc. There is more work involved in those deals. If we can see it straight from the outset, we can usually give a very accurate, fair price from the get-go, as opposed to stop-starting. I also find as well with from the perspective of the SRA, if we submit an application without the ultimate the beneficial owner being identified for whatever reason, that the SRA will work that out, and they will want to see, they will come back to us and ask, well, who is above this company, who is attached to this person, associated relationships, partners, spouses, children, etc. So it's really helpful to identify that all from the beginning, as opposed to just hoping the questions won't be asked later on, because they will be 100% of the time. They will be. So yeah, really important to establish that right from the set. So
Of course it is.
the get-go, rather, just so we can all be upfront with our costs, our timeframes, and we can get that all going and across the line, and then we can actually start the heads of terms and get the deal going.
And from a contractual point of view, who are the contracting parties?
Yeah,
that's why we need to know. Certainly from my point of view, that is why we need to also to know who are these people, who is going to be actually putting pen to paper and signing the contract. Because without that, you've got no deal.
Yeah, and then payment. Where's the funds coming from for the deal?
Absolutely right.
Who's paying? Where's that money coming from?
Yeah, well, obviously I've got my anti-money laundering obligations as well that I need to comply with, and tracking down UBOs is part of that. We need to find out who are the ultimate beneficial owners, and we need to get them ID'd, make sure they are who they say they are. How is the transaction being funded? If I'm acting for a buyer, where's that money coming from? We need to check source of funds. We need to be on the ball in terms of anti-money laundering compliance, and finding out who these UBOs are is a huge part of that as well.
Yeah, so I've worked with you, Mark, on a number of deals over the last 2 or 3 years now, and the SPA seems to be sort of one of the largest pieces of work involved in the transaction. Having a specially designed SPA tailored for law firms, just seems more increasingly important. But also having a separate one for law firms, traditionally owned law firms, shall we say, solicitor owned, and then another type of SPA really for non-lawyer owned or non-lawyer purchased law firms. How do you find the SPA process with sellers, specifically around ABSs and non-lawyer ownership?
Yeah. So you and I have worked together on a few deals over the years, and I feel between us we've put together some decent precedent provisions that relate specifically to transactions within the legal sector. Making sure that the target company has complied with its regulatory requirements as far as the SRA is concerned. And from if you're acting for a buyer in particular, you want to make sure that we've got quite robust warranty cover in there from the sellers that are talking about that are confirming that they have complied with those regulations. And just for anybody who doesn't know, a warranty is a contractual statement that you're confirming to be true. If you put a warranty in an agreement, if it turns out to be true, then that's absolutely fine. Nothing that anybody has to do about that or worry about. If it is untrue, then the seller has to confirm why it isn't true. And as long as they provide sufficient detail as to why it's not true, then the seller's covered and the buyer can't make a claim.
I think it's fair to say as well that the SRA, although they are, not a body that sign off SPAs, probably won't give you sort of feedback on that SPA. It's slightly outside their remit. They have seen our SPAs, and they are happy with them, and they've said that. So it's good to know that we have a precedent that is compliant, shall we say, as far as it can be with the SRA. That's been
and that's always handy to have in place, because once you've got a precedent that works, and these kind of provisions will always apply to these kind of transactions. And so once you've got a precedent that works, we can use that as the foundation, and then we can tweak them here or there, add bits, take bits away, whatever we need to make it bespoke to that particular transaction, and it works really well.
Absolutely. That nicely feeds into asset purchases, as well as sort of full firm lock, stock and barrel purchases as well, if you like. So an asset purchase we recently did was Glaisyers, and we did that. We bought that from an administrator who was essentially sort of splitting up the practice and selling off the different books of work areas along with those staff to different buyers. So Glaisyers was a firm bought specifically through an administration process, and we bought just a single department, or a few departments, was it?
It was a few departments.
A few departments. So how was that structured, and how is that different, from your perspective, Mark, and I'll speak about the regulatory side of that as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So you've got with a transaction, an acquisition. There's essentially two types. You've got an asset purchase and a share purchase. There's just a little bit of background information just to be helpful. The way I always describe the difference between the two is if you think of a company as being a car, if you're buying if you do a share purchase, you're buying the entire car, everything that comes with it, everything that's inside it. If you're buying the assets of the business, you're taking all the good stuff out of the car that you like the look of. So if it's got some nice leather seats, if it's got a nice walnut gear knob,
good analogies.
Yeah. If it's got some great Michelin tyres that have only just been put on, you might want to keep all that stuff. So you take that off the car, and then that's yours, and you go and you put that on your existing car, and you run with it, and you make it better. All the rubbish that you don't want, you leave in the car. So that's I use that to help my clients understand the difference between a share purchase and asset purchase. With an asset purchase, you're very much cherry picking the good things out of that business and taking them with you, leaving as much of the liabilities behind. So with Glaisyers, it was very much these are the departments that Cartwright King want to run with. And
they fit our model, didn't they?
They fit your model. I think there was 2 or 3. I think it was the care department. And I believe the criminal department. I think it was. They fit your model well. They seem to have a decent client base, a decent portfolio of ongoing matters, and you guys wanted to pick that up and run with it.
And they had a strong team, didn't they? A strong staff team. We were particularly interested in that continuity of client care and seeing through, what was ongoing as well. And also they're known in the area, that team were. It was important for us to continue with that and have that legacy that continues with Cartwright King. Yeah,
absolutely right. Something else I should probably mention is the main difference between an asset purchase from a business where it's still running and a business that's in administration. Purchasing assets from a business that's in administration, you're very much relying on the administrators. You're playing to their tune, essentially. I mentioned earlier about having warranties within an agreement to protect the buyer.
Yes.
But when you bought these departments and Glaisyers, I remember kind of saying, look, we're dealing with the administrators here. The administrators are not going to be interested in giving us warranties. They will say to us, we don't work in this business. We don't know anything about the business. We can't give warranties. So you're very much buying these departments on what you'd refer to as an as-seen basis. But that's where your good due diligence comes in, because you guys obviously looked at the books and seen that the portfolio of ongoing work and work in progress was good. They've got a good, strong client list in these departments, and you guys wanted to take on those clients. So it's very much just a question of defining who those clients were and making sure that the files attaching to those clients were transferred and included within the asset purchase agreement itself.
That's right. And one of the most important things when we are at that stage of we've got SRA approval, if required, for a sale transfer, or in this case an asset transfer, is in the case of an asset transfer, you are moving files from one legal entity, from one SRA numbered entity to another, and that requires the client consent. The most important thing to remember with client files is that client files don't belong to the law firm, they belong to the client, and that really has to be echoed and seen all the way through. And we need client consent to be able to legitimately pick those files up and move them across. And something we assist regulators with regularly is that process. It's managing the client file transfer process, assisting administrators with that, and seeing that through from start to finish, really ensuring clients are signed up, the client, and ensuring that they are aware of the process from start to finish, that they know where their client file is going, and that we've got consent from them, whether that's by phone call, that's email, ideally both, I know sort of text message is used now. It gives the option of, do you want to move across, yes or no?
Yeah.
It sort of simplifies it, but gives the client ultimately the decision of where their file goes. And, if they decide not to move their client to that law firm, then, we may ask where that file wants to go, or we can send that file back to the client, and reimburse them from the client account.
Yeah.
And client account nicely leads on to, the next sort of big issue really is client funds, client monies in, some kind of asset purchase situation where books are being split potentially and moved around. Obviously, we need to have our finger on the pulse with the client account and make sure that the monies are, one, whole, so that client account is whole from the day one, present that to the SRA, evidence that with a client account review, but then also oversee the safe transfer of those client files, and that's famously done by a solicitor manager role. We've worked in those sectors for years. My experience, over the last sort of 10 years working in different law firms, under different solicitor managers and being part of that team and seeing through that process. Really, really key important part. One of the longest and usually sometimes the biggest parts of that job is making sure that client account is, fully reconciled, whole, and able to move from A to B, and evidence that to the SRA at the end of the process. And that also gives the SRA the comfort that this is being, properly managed, overseen, and dealt with by professionals who know what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to touch on something that you mentioned there. Someone listening to this might think to themselves, that surely that poses a risk if I'm agreeing to part with my cash for a client list and none of them have to say yes to that transfer. What am I paying for? And I suppose in order to kind of mitigate that risk, and I know what you guys did as well, you took on the key staff from the departments that you were taking on who service those clients. I think a client who knows that their fear isn't going to change as part of the process is perhaps more likely to say that they're happy for the file to transfer. It's going to be business as usual. It's just going to be a different name above the door. The person actually running the file isn't going to change. The person you've got the relationship with isn't going to change. And I know from my point of view as an individual that's going to mean the world to me. Knowing that there's going to be continuity in terms of who's acting for me. And that's another big part of an asset deal is the TUPE regulations. When you're taking on a business, if you're taking on any business under an asset transfer, does that business have staff, and are those staff going to move over? In a lot of cases, the staff will move over, and those staff are entitled to enjoy the same benefits that they've always had under their existing contract of employment. And that's where I mentioned earlier around you can't really ask the administrators to give too many warranties. But if you're buying a business as a going concern in ordinary circumstances, one of the biggest fields that you will find is provision around the staff who you're taking on, because as soon as those staff transfer, they become your responsibility. And so if the seller had been abrogating their duties as an employer, after completion, any grievances that those staff may have with their employer become your problem as the buyer.
Yeah, and I think having tools, letters and conversations with clients, early on in the process helps manage that. If it comes as a surprise or an after the event, that's when clients feel as though they've been unfairly treated or blindsided into the deal. Will take away their business then, which isn't going to help anyone. At that point, you've paid for the WIP, you've paid for that list, but then lost the client on the back end of it. And of course, there's different ways of doing those deals. Sometimes they are WIP based, or sometimes there's an upfront cost. So especially if there's an upfront cost, you really want to ensure that how you manage that file transfer, that client file transfer list, and make sure you get consents is really imperative. We've had really high success rates of getting those clients across the line safely and soundly, finishing through that way. But I think that's a good point to digress slightly into now a full share sale, buying a law firm sort of lock stock like I said earlier, where this is a new owner coming into a law firm that's already established. So on those kind of agreements, obviously we still need to explain to the client that there is a new ownership in the law firm, but their file will be remaining where they are. Their caseworker will continue, business as normal. But it would be helpful to really understand in those situations how the SPA differs really from an asset to a full sale purchase.
Okay, yeah. So with I kind of touched on the analogy before, with a share purchase, you're buying the whole company. It's warts and all. You're taking on you're not able to cherry pick the good bits that you want and leave some of the liabilities behind. You're taking all the liabilities and all the assets at the same time. And I suppose then the key is really to make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're buying in those circumstances, because there's potentially a lot more things that could come out and bite you down the line. The last thing you want to do is buy a company and then 6 months later you find out that there's a whole heap of things going on in the background that you weren't aware of. So
the due diligence exercise is really important.
Yes, I was just about to say that. The key thing is that due diligence exercise. And typically if I'm acting for a buyer, the due diligence questionnaire that I will produce will be 20 odd pages long, and that's still considered short form. Where we're asking all sorts of different questions about how the business has been set up, how it's been run, things like what assets do you have, who owns them, are they subject to hire purchase, financial arrangements, who are the employees, that kind of thing.
And we've worked together on these due diligence exercises, in the past as well, sort of fitting, part of the regulatory in with what you're doing and looking at the regulatory side of the due diligence as well. What's happened in the past, the insurance side, staff, client accounts, qualified accountants reports, etc. This all feeds in, doesn't it, to a larger piece. So from the very outset, before we even, get heads of terms agreed and get anywhere near sort of exchanging contracts at that stage, that they know exactly what they are getting.
Yeah, and that's it. That's the key. You want to make sure that you've agreed a price for those shares, and are those shares worth what you think they're worth?
Yeah,
that is the main point of having that due diligence exercise. And a good due diligence exercise will answer those questions for you and will provide you with the peace of mind that actually this business is worth what we think it's worth. It will also, we can also deal with any issues that we find in that due diligence process by way of an indemnity in the share purchase agreement itself. So, you can say, look, we've found a particular issue. There's a good chance that this might come out of the woodwork and bite us in the future after we've purchased. And so, because it's an identified known issue, if it's something that the seller could have dealt with better in particular, then we can say, look, this issue happened on your watch. We're buying the company from you. It's got potential to affect the company after we've purchased. So any losses that we suffer as a result of this specific issue, we want you to put your hand in your pocket and cover our losses in recognition of the fact that this happened on your watch and we've now got to take on that responsibility. That's not fair. A good due diligence exercise is key for that. On the back end of the transaction, we have what we call a disclosure exercise. So the share purchase agreement will contain a whole raft of warranties, these contractual statements that the seller is confirming to be true. Towards the back end of the transaction, the seller will go through those warranties line by line and will make sure that they are true and accurate. And if they aren't, they will have to explain why, and they'll do this by way of what we call a formal disclosure letter. And the way that works, it's really a double-edged sword. I say double-edged sword, it acts as a sword and a shield, I suppose. By making the seller go through this process, the buyer gets comfort that there aren't any last-minute skeletons about to come out of the closet. Also, make sure that the seller has an opportunity to protect themselves. and so it works to the benefit of both parties, because as long as the seller gives sufficient detail about the warranty that isn't true, the buyer can't make a claim about it because the buyer has knowledge of it before they pull the trigger and parted with their money at completion. If they didn't know it, the argument is, well, company's probably not worth as much as it was, because we wouldn't have paid X had we known about this particular issue. And so that's why the warranties are in place. They are there to protect both parties.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because how that differs from the asset purchase, just jumping back to the regulatory side again, is that the asset purchase usually requires SRA reporting. There may be an exercise to close down the entity, etc., submit account reports, but it's mainly reporting, on the issues, keeping the SRA updated with how it's going, client consents, etc., ensuring that. Whereas, a lock stock sale, buying the whole car, as used that analogy, requires, formal ownership to be approved, and that has a time frame with the SRA, which is really important. Why, there's a big exercise at the beginning to identify the ultimate beneficial owner and all the subsequent layers of ownership, that may be potentially involved in the sale, whether that's 100 holding companies, trusts and mid-go, big-go, top-goes, as we've seen, in lots of the private equity deals we do, or whether it's it's quite a vanilla structure, shall we say, quite savoury in the sense that it may just be a holding company or two layers of ownership with just a few small group of owners in, more of a wealth management kind of setup. But then it's important to know, I suppose, that at that point that we submit the application, from submitting the application to approval, the SRA do quote 90 days. I think we are seeing slightly longer timescales, at the moment, but those are coming down. The SRA are doing well to get those back in line. But then obviously for more complex ownership applications, private equity, like I mentioned before, 156 applications, that's not going to be done in 90 days. It's important to make the buyer aware from day dot, listen, let's get this bit done first, so we can get the application in time, then we can start to go through more of the sort of the heavier due diligence side, work out those kinks along the way as we gear up to exchange and then finally completion. And the SRA are alive to commercial deals. They understand there's money pressures on, whether it's price sensitive or not. We've done a number of price sensitive deals over the years, one quite recently as well. And the SRA are very alive to that. And on a recent price sensitive deal, they turned it around in less than 2 weeks, which is a really, really sort of strong point for the SRA. That's working at sort of FCA kind of timeframes, which can be much quicker for smaller applications than this 90-day sort of blanket deadline or timeframe the SRA give. But then, making sort of larger clients alive that this will take longer, and managing that from the outset. Everyone understands the time frame. This is what we're working towards. And also the SRA will be good, and they will give us a couple of weeks towards the end of where they where they're aiming towards, to say, right, we're close now, and that gives us time to go back, get insurance in place, talk to staff rather. Those final parts of the puzzle really that lead up to completion.
If we're talking about managing expectations and timeframes, you've obviously got your stage of the process that needs to be followed. It takes time. From my point of view, I have the same kind of timeframes that need to be considered. So from a client's point of view, if they're looking if they want to get an idea of how long something like this might take, from my side of things, I always say to people, allow around about 3 months, for a decent sized transaction.
Similar then, very similar to
to go through from start to finish. Then you're looking at 3 months from your side potentially, and the same from me. So it's just making sure that people are alive to that. Yeah,
that's great. Final question, Mark. I know you're a busy man, and I will leave you to the rest of the day.
Okay.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee, 100%. You've been to my house, Wes, and I have 2 coffee machines. I've got pod and bean. It was my oyster as far as
coffee connoisseur.
I wouldn't say a connoisseur. got into it about a year ago, and just trying as many beans as I can.
Baked,
Yeah,
pies.
I like cannelloni. Is that a bean? I don't even know. The stronger the better.
Good man.
I like a good strong
Caffeine.
Heavily roasted bean.
Caffeine keeps us going in transactional details.
Heavily roasted bean, yeah. Company I use has got a bean rating for how dark the bean is. It goes 1 to 5, and I found they do a bean that it's not 5 beans, it's 5 skull and crossbones, and that is as dark as it gets, and I love that.
Well, you've heard it there, guys. Thank you very much for joining us on Cafe CK. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Wes. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Crossbones, and that is as dark as it gets.